All right, wanted to introduce our first speaker, Susan Hua. So she's going to talk about a little bit more on making sense of the Teochew College graduates and their language maintenance as a result of enrolling in higher education. So that's the title of the presentation. So just a quick bio of Susan. Pronouns are she, hers, identifies as Teochew Chinese American and a daughter of refugees of the Vietnam War. Originally from Massachusetts, Susan currently lives in Aurora, Colorado, where she serves as the College Readiness Program Manager for the Title V grant at the Community College of Aurora. Susan is a doctoral candidate in the Education Administration Higher Education program at the University of Hawai, Mānoa College of Education. Her research focuses on engagement strategies and supports of the Teochew students and bilingual students of less commonly taught languages, LCTLs, in higher education. So give a virtual round of applause to Susan.
Like, where's the mute button? Hi, everyone. My name is Susan Hua, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm so excited to be here today to just share a little bit about my research, which is making sense of Teochew college graduates and their language maintenance as a result of enrolling in higher education. I wanted to kick off with an acknowledgement of the land that I'm presenting from Aurora, Colorado, which is the traditional lands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, and Sioux tribes, as well as 48 additional tribes who have been forcibly removed as a result of colonization. I recognize these Indigenous groups as the ancestral and current stewards of the land and pay my respects to the leaders and people who continue to fight for justice on unceded land. So just a little bit about myself. As you just heard, I identify as the daughter of refugees of the Vietnam War, as well as Teochew Chinese American. I'm also currently serving as the College Readiness Program Manager for the Title V team at the Community College of Aurora. I grew up in a very white town in Massachusetts, and so that really shaped the way that I experienced language and identity growing up. And so this dissertation research came from reflections of my own experiences with language, especially as I moved further away from home. I really want to focus on bilingualism in higher education and understanding how speakers of less commonly taught languages, or LCTLs, are able to maintain their language in a college setting, given the lack of instructional spaces. So with that, in my study overview, my committee really encouraged me to focus on my own people, which was really, really great. I had originally wanted to look at any speaker of LCTLs, and they were like, you know what, that's a huge range of people. So just narrow down because your people are important. So just to contextualize, if you didn't know, Teochew are from the Bioswa city or Taozhou in the Guangdong province of China. Just given the history of the Teochew folks, there were two main waves of displacement. And so the first happened in the early 1900s, where war and environmental factors led to displacement into Southeast Asia. The second wave came around the mid to late 1900s. And so the Vietnam War, the rise of the Khmer Rouge regime, and that really led folks from Southeast Asia into places like Australia, Europe, various parts of the United States, and I'm sure there are other parts on the map that are not marked as well. Studies of K-12 students have demonstrated that language maintenance plays a large role in the identity formation of a person. And so this has implications for Teochew speakers, just given the wide range of the diaspora, as well as the lack of opportunity to use language outside of family and your separation from family while in college. And so just to quickly go through my literature review, there were four main themes that emerged from my literature review that really pointed to how structural and social racism impacts Asian Americans and diasporic identity development, as well as language use within immigrant families. There also was an emerging theme in terms of how important higher education was in terms of setting a space for Indigenous and heritage language revitalization movements. And so the conceptual frameworks that I used really pointed to significance of study for me. And so bridging Yaso's community cultural wealth, as well as Strayhorn's sense of belonging, I really want to emphasize how having linguistic and familial wealth was really a big contributor in how a student can have a sense of belonging on campus. My theoretical frameworks were used to really highlight the lens through which I saw the data that I was analyzing, as well as the questions that I developed for my participants. And so together, Crenshaw's intersectionality and communication accommodation theory work together to really highlight and emphasize how power impacts language choice and the complicated identities for Teochew folks in the US, just given the migration patterns that their families come from. So with that, it led to my overarching research question, which is how do Teochew speaking students experience language maintenance while college going? And this was supported by 3 additional questions. The first of which is how do Teochew students make sense of their identities in connection to language? How do Teochew students perceive their interactions with family members after college going? And then how does college going impact language use at home for Teochew students? And so I use interpretative phenomenological analysis, or IPA, as my methodology. And this falls under phenomenological study, but really has an emphasis on details in the interpretation of one's experiences. As a researcher, my role was to make sense of how my participants made sense of their language maintenance experience. Some highlights for my methodology: I interviewed 25 participants who had self-identified fluency in Teochew and English, lived away from college, and then used Teochew as their primary communication with family. And they were supposed to have graduated within 4 to 10 years, really to give that time for reflection. I wanted to really highlight the pieces of my methodology that pointed back to ancestry and language. And so what was really awesome was I started my interviews with 5 phrases for participants to translate from English into Teochew to really emphasize the range of speech, depending on where their families came from. And so it was really awesome to see these dialectic differences of similarities and differences where they were saying things like translating how to, like I'm hungry, or I'm going to sleep, or I don't want to go to school. So that was really awesome. I also encouraged my participants to use Teochew in the interview process if it felt natural to do so. And they were able to share stories of things that their parents said to them when they were growing up, or just other pieces of history that really connected us through the interview process. And so those were 2 really, really great points that really tied back to ancestry. Some major themes and recommendations. There is absolutely not enough time to go through a whole dissertation review of themes, but I really wanted to point out some really salient points that came up for me as I was thinking about today's Scholars Collective. So I broke my themes into 2 categories, the first of which was framing the Teochew experience to really understand and situate Teochew folks in the United States. And then the second was really focusing on the college experience. And so with that, the 2 main pieces that I thought were really salient for today was really looking at Teochew as a family language policy. And so a lot of my participants shared that their family members or their parents really emphasized using Teochew only in the household. And so going as far as to say, which dad can't understand, and refusing to talk to them if they didn't speak Teochew at home. The other piece was Teochew as a connector to elders. And just given the migration and how they were trying to set up their lives here in the US, a lot of times my participants were left at home with their grandparents while their parents worked. This really forced them to learn Teochew as the main way of communicating with their elders and being able to identify what their needs were. But a lot of them also talked about how special that connection was with their grandparents and how their grandparents were oracles and storytellers, and how that really shaped their identities as they were growing up. Moving on to the college going experience, again, I was looking at language maintenance while they were in college. And what was really fascinating to me was this idea of the limitation of language. And so when you're growing up with a language that's mostly spoken, it's really hard to learn words that are outside of the scope of what you're learning. And so if your parents didn't talk to you about plant pathogens or about, microbiology growing up, you most likely did not have that as language as you were transitioning to majoring in things in college. And so with that, a lot of my participants shared that as life got more complicated for them, as they were going through college, they found less and less words to be able to identify these pieces with their parents in conversation. And so a lot of times their communication ended up being very surface level. And of course, the traditional check-ins of like, did you eat yet? How are you doing? Did you put on a warm sweater today? And so this made them feel like they weren't able to really share their college experience with their family. The second piece that really came up as a salient theme was mental health concerns and the inability to share that with family as well. And so beyond the stigmas that we know of mental health in API communities, they also identified that there weren't really words to put to mental health concerns such as depression and anxiety. And so overall, these two pieces really emphasize the minimization of their needs, but also their successes. And so if they're receiving an award for a leadership opportunity or put on a really great committee for research, there was really no way to share that, and they had to boil it down to really simple terms for their family. It's really important to also note that as they were finding the separation between family and discussing their college experience, they really turned to their faculty and staff to really try to find support systems from them. But because of how the monolithic experience of being Chinese and really only speaking Mandarin came up in various points in various settings in their college experience, they found that their faculty and staff didn't really want to build relationships past that point of being like, oh, you're Chinese. And so they really felt invisible and unseen in their college experience. This is a really quick summary of recommendations. I asked my participants to reflect on what would have changed their experience regarding their language use and identity development in college. And these were the different points that they brought up. And so, Chinese diaspora classes, exploring through Asian American studies, making use of cultural center spaces, and expanding requirements into STEM were some of the more salient points that came up for them. And lastly, I wanted to reflect on the question of what kind of ancestor I want to be. And I love this question so much because as I was doing my dissertation research, this actually came up in conversation with my participants. And so for me, it really boiled down to 3 words: mattering, power, and legacy. And so my family and my participants' families endured a lot of sacrifice as they were crossing the ocean to leave, poverty, war, just so much trauma that happened to them. And I really want my family to know that they didn't endure sacrifice just to not matter, and that their voices really mattered in terms of identifying as Teochew and being from a really unique situation. And so for me, this research was really about mattering. The other piece was thinking about power and how when you're in a power dynamic where you don't have power, you tend to be left with less pride for who you are. And so I really wanted to cultivate pride and reclaim power for Teochew folks where I felt like I didn't have that growing up. And lastly, I really thought about how I was so privileged to be in this position as a doctoral student to conduct this research on my own people, and how there really isn't that much literature in the grand scheme of things in terms of Teochew folks. And so this research hopefully is the beginning of a foundation for other folks who want to research Teochew people in the US and leaving behind a legacy. And lastly, I just wanted to share a heartfelt joisia or thank you to the RNS committee for having me here today, to all of you, my participants, and most importantly, my ancestors for building strong foundations for me to stand on. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Let's do a round. Oh.
Yeah, let's applause. Let's do it. Unmute. Say yay. Yay, Susan.
Yay, go Susan.
All right. Wow. Mattering, I wrote this down. So mattering, power, and legacy is what you want to leave behind. If we have just one question from the audience, we're going to try to do one question, but we'll have another kind of Q&A at the end as well. But is there any dying questions that we want to have Susan answer really quick? Okay, either unmute or looks like Dirk has his hands raised. So Dirk.
Susan, why does language matter? That's language, and we are at risk of losing language as an intergenerational inheritance. So why does language matter in the work as much as it seemed to in your telling of it? So.
Yeah, I was really struck by the literature I read on diasporic memories and how diaspora is defined by so many different pieces, especially when you're moving from your homeland and you're trying to find these pieces to hold on to your culture. I reflected on really not being able to speak to anyone outside of my family in anything but English, and how, we went to Mandarin school growing up, but because of the language differences, I really felt like I was struggling with learning Mandarin. And so I think for me, language ties me back to my family, and having that family foundation is so important, especially as I think about, building my own future and having kids and what that means for them to connect with my parents as well. And so it's such a big part of, who they are and how we identify. And it's been such a foundational piece of just really tying back to my elders and my grandparents.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Susan. And looks like you're going to be defending your dissertation on Monday, so we need a lot of celebration and positive vibes your way. So yes,